So hello, welcome to the video and welcome to Folkestone. It's a beautiful evening, so I thought I'd get out and show you a little bit of my hometown. But it's a bit of a celebration this evening because not only is it almost the second anniversary of the date when I created my channel, but I've also just reached 5,000 subscribers. So I threw out an invitation for you to send me through some questions because I've never done a Q&A video before on my channel, and I'm going to use this opportunity to celebrate those two achievements and to answer some of your questions. And to prove that I have learned a few things over these last 2 years, I have a special announcement coming up at the end of the video. So if you'd like to hear the answers to my questions and hear my exciting news, stick around.
Hi, I'm Matt. Over the last 25 years, I've travelled a lot. I've lived in 5 countries on 4 continents. I've flown over 1.3 million miles. I've visited over 100 countries, every American state, but I'm nowhere near done. So subscribe to the channel so you can come with me.
So as we sit here in front of the white cliffs of Dover, we've actually got a Spitfire and another Second World War plane flying over, which you might catch a glimpse of in the background, one of the benefits of living in this corner of the world. So the questions basically fall into 4 groups, the first of which is about me. So I'm going to put the name of the person who asked the question down below, just to save a bit of time. So let's get into it. So the first question is, what kicked off my love of travel? Well, I was lucky when I was growing up to be able to go to Spain most summers on a family holiday. And I really loved the airplanes and I really loved the airports from the very first time I passed through them. So that really sort of got me going. But then when I was about 18, a fellow called Michael Palin released a series called Around the World in 80 Days. It looks really dated these days. So Michael's story about how he got around the world really hooked me and gave me that love of travel that I still pursue today. The next question is, what job did I used to do that allowed me to live in those 5 countries that I talk about in my opening credits? Well, I qualified as a chartered accountant, having got a degree in economics. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and that was as good an option as any. But the advantage of accountancy as a profession is that it is really global. Most other professions, the law, medicine, even architecture, require you to re-qualify if you move to a different jurisdictions, but accountancy doesn't. So I was able to take those skills and take them around the world. I was also quite lucky to work for companies that had international relocation relatively frequently. When I was training to be an accountant, I specialised in the hospitality industry, and I actually audited quite a few different hotel groups, and the first job I got when I left the accounting firm was in hospitality. And a question I received was, what's the hardest thing about working in the hotel industry? Well, there's quite a few bad things. The pay's usually terrible, the hours are usually terrible, but the good thing is you get the opportunity to work around the world, particularly if you're working for one of the larger international hotel groups. The worst thing for me was the general managers. Now, this was a few years ago, but part of my job was compliance and making sure people followed the rules. And almost every general manager I met felt that the rules didn't apply to them, and they had some very creative reasons as to why that was the case. And it was always a real struggle and a challenge to get them to realise that the rules applied to them as well. So for me, that was the hardest part. So the next question is whether I've ever had flying lessons and whether I'd be interested. Well, no and yes are the answer to those 2 questions. From the age of about 8 to probably 13, pilot was the job I wanted to do. I even wrote to British Airways and asked them what I needed to do to become a pilot. I'm sure hundreds, if not thousands of kids did that, and they had a standard letter that they fired back. But when I was sort of 13, 14, I got quite tall, my eyesight failed, I had some bad knee injuries, and I was also rubbish at physics. So there were 4 clues that perhaps being a professional pilot wasn't the career for me. I have actually flown a plane. I need to be quite vague about the specifics because I'm sure it broke a lot of laws. But when I was living in the United States, I had to get from A to B, and there was no commercial option. And I had to get from A to B with a guy who happens to be a flight instructor. So he convinced me that it would be most efficient for him to fly us on a small plane. We did, and on the way back he invited me to have a go. And about 2 hours later I was still flying it. We were getting closer and closer to the landing runway, descending, banking, lining up, and he still let me take control. And it was only about 150 metres away from the boundary of the runway that he actually took control back. So perhaps I have some natural talent for it, I don't know. I'd like to do it. It's expensive, it's a big commitment of time, and when you've qualified it's very expensive to maintain the hours, to maintain your rating. So it's not a priority, but you know, maybe one day. And the final question in this section is, how many avios have I got? Well, I've got about 150,000 at the moment, which is probably about the right number. I always advise people not to carry a balance because a devaluation could come at any time, which will reduce the value of what you've got. Got a few bookings in mind, but about 150 is my number at the moment. So on to the next section, which is about my flying experiences. And the first question there is, where did I first fly to? Well, it was Girona in northeastern Spain, but you wouldn't have guessed that one. The family was on its way to Lloret de Mar for one of our summer Spanish holidays, and a great time we had. Such a great time that I've never been back. Next question is about the single best flying experience I've ever had in economy and in business. Well, I'll take business first, and I think everyone's first flight in business is pretty memorable. Mine was on Air Canada from London to Winnipeg, would you believe it? And I was very excited. It was a great experience, made all the more so by the fact that my company was paying for it. Another business experience I remember very vividly was my first flight on Virgin Atlantic in upper class, back in the 90s, but from London across to San Francisco. And this was in the days when you got the chauffeur-driven pickup at both ends, and that was quite an experience, I have to tell you. And again, even more so because my company was paying. When it comes to economy, I tend to remember the bad ones more than I remember the good ones, but one particularly good one I do remember came about simply because of the date that I chose to fly, which was December the 31st. It was London to Seoul on Asiana in economy, but I think all told there were 6 people in economy that night. So I think I had 2, maybe 3 dinners, quite a few drinks, and then I had half a plane to myself to get a decent kip. You don't get economy flights much better than that one was, let me tell you. And obviously the flip side is, what is the worst experience in economy and also in business? Well, business I think has to be that flight from Miami to London, which I documented quite thoroughly in this video up here. It was just pretty terrible. And in economy, there's a few that spring to mind. I might save some of my stories for a 10,000 subscriber special, but the one that I do remember that is probably the most amazing thing I've ever seen on a plane was on a British Airways flight from, I think, Gatwick down to Jersey. And one of the flight attendants believed that a passenger had called her a name. It began with a B, I won't repeat it here, but 5 letters long, wasn't a great word. I didn't hear anything even though I was only a couple of rows away, but she was very upset about it, and she was so upset she was still arguing with the passenger and soliciting people nearby as to whether they had heard anything so she could get their names and addresses. She was still doing that when the wheels of the plane touched the runway. She was still standing in the aisle arguing with the passengers. Quite a remarkable thing to have seen, and that's probably the most amazing thing I've ever seen in an economy class flight. Next question is whether I've had any white knuckle moments or any never again moments, and not really, no. I've had 2 go-arounds, neither of which were particularly dramatic. One was arriving into Flin Flon, Manitoba, that's one to look up, where I believe at the time, I don't know if it still is, but at the time it was a visual-only airfield with no instruments at all. And the pilot just misjudged it, so we went around and got it the second time. And the second one was when we were diverted from Bangkok to Pattaya on a Lufthansa 747, where Pattaya wasn't quite ready for us. There were still vehicles on the runway, and a big old heavy 747 had to do a go around. Again, it wasn't exactly last minute, it wasn't that exciting, but it's probably the best I've got. I remember being a little bit concerned when we were landing into Denver one February. We spent ages in the cloud and visibility was negligible, and the cloud cover was very low, and it was far longer going through the clouds than I thought it should have been, but we landed safely with nothing to report, so I think I've been probably quite lucky compared to some. Favourite airport to depart or transit through? Well, Changi Airport will always have a place in my heart. When I lived in Singapore, I was travelling quite frequently, and not all of the airports in the region are up to the standard of Changi, so it was always a delight to travel either to it or back to it, because it just worked. It was always reliable, it was always comfortable, and it was just a solid airport to travel. I really like Koh Samui Airport because it's mostly indoor-outdoor with sort of gardens everywhere, a little bit like Honolulu, but just a lot more manageable. And I also quite like flying into Los Angeles, particularly on a clear day, which in California you do get quite a lot. You get a brilliant view of the Los Angeles basin, and you can see for miles and miles and miles, and it's always a pleasure. As regards worst airports, well, to travel through, lots of the American airports feature, I'm afraid. Miami, I don't much enjoy. JFK is not much fun usually, and LA is not usually that much fun either. But I've got to give a special mention to Terminal 1 in Manila, where I also lived for a period. The Philippines is a beautiful country with beautiful people, but it's a terrible airport, and it really does not present the best face to people visiting the country. Next question is, what's my favourite airline? And I always used to answer this with Air New Zealand. I used to fly them by preference between Sydney and Los Angeles, even if it added 5 or 6 hours to the journey by having to stop in Auckland. But they used to have a really excellent business class product, good service, and it was just a pleasant experience travelling through Auckland. I have to put in a word for Qatar Airways as well. Their hard product is excellent, although as you've seen in my videos I do find the service can be a bit patchy, but I think out of all of them Singapore Airlines has to be the best. It's got a very good hard product and very good service. It's been a while since I've had the chance to fly on them, but if you subscribe to the channel I'm sure you'll see me fly on them at some point in the future. So the next question is, what is my favourite route? And I've got my notes here because I actually looked it up. Now, by favourite, I assume you mean most frequently flown, which is Sydney to Melbourne, which I've done 16 times. I've done Sydney to Auckland 15 times, partly because of my love for Air New Zealand, and I've done London to Dublin 14 times. Long haul, it's Singapore to Sydney, which I've also done 14 times. Favourite route is always somewhere that takes me somewhere entertaining and enjoyable, and ideally somewhere new. But if you look at specifically where I have flown, those would have to be my favourites. And which airline do I use the most? Well, looking at my records over the 800 and something flights I've taken, BA is top, probably unsurprisingly, but the second on the list is a bit of a surprise, which is US Air. Now that got gobbled up by American, who were third on the list some years ago, so between the two of them they're still not quite up there with BA. And then fourth on the list is actually Singapore Airlines, because I did used to fly them quite a lot, particularly when I lived in Singapore. Next question is, what is the longest tier point run I've ever done? Well, I've never done a Hawaii, although I've got a feeling that next year I might do one. That's currently showing as one of the best ways of getting tier points, and when I have to renew next year I'm going to look quite seriously at whether to tack that Hawaii leg onto a West Coast trip. But I have done an 880 tier point run from Bucharest to Phoenix, with lots and lots of stops in between. That's the best I've done, but I think I can probably beat it next year. So the next section is all about the places that I've been, and the first question is, which was my favourite US state and which was my least favourite / most surprising? Well, it's easy to answer that with California, which is where I lived in the US. It is a great state. It has great variety to the geography. You can ski, you can surf, you've got, Death Valley, you've got some great cities. It's a tremendously diverse state. Well, I'm going to give the answer to that question as South Dakota, which surprises quite a few people. It's geographically, it's really quite interesting, but it's also absolutely stuffed with wildlife. I could barely drive more than 5 miles without having to stop for some amazing animal wandering across the road in front of me. So I think South Dakota is probably my favourite US state. My least favourite, I'm going to go for North Dakota here. I went to Fargo mainly because I really liked the movie, but I went there on the 4th of July weekend and nobody was there. It was the strangest thing. The city of Fargo had pretty much emptied out. Everyone had gone to the countryside where it was a little bit cooler to go and sit by a lake. There was only really one restaurant that was open all weekend for those stragglers or the unimaginative who hadn't bothered to leave, and that was what I found in Fargo. It was the strangest thing. North Dakota is obviously fairly empty and a bit of a wilderness in the winter, but if I have to give any state the title of the wooden spoon, I'm going to give it to North Dakota. The next question is best and worst first impressions of a country, and worst I have to give to Venezuela. I'll tell the story in a bit more detail in this video here, but I arrived late at night during a civil uprising, and the hotel I was staying at had assumed I wasn't coming, so had cancelled my car pickup. And all that I'd read before visiting, it was a few years ago, so it was before the internet, but all that I had read was to be wary of the road from the airport to the city, because mobs would drop concrete slabs on the taxis to immobilise them and rob the occupants. So I had no choice but to get a taxi up this road under all of these bridges to get to the city. It wasn't a great welcome to Venezuela. It did get better, but it wasn't a great start. And the best impression is usually a tourist destination, and I've been lucky enough to go to a few in the South Pacific. Vanuatu and Samoa spring to mind, where there's often a welcoming committee of local dancers or local musicians at the airports to welcome you. You get the lei around your neck, and it is a brilliant way of being welcomed into a new country, particularly if you've been sitting on a plane for quite a long time before you get there. Next question is, what's the one place I most want to go to? Well, again, I made a video where I talked about 6 countries, but I have to say I think Saudi Arabia is top of the list at the moment. Not a wildly popular one, and I'm very well aware of the controversies about visiting the kingdom at the moment, but it's never really allowed tourists in, and I think it's a great place to visit so that you can see for yourself what the place is like, but also get there before everybody else does, because it's not often that a country that has banned tourism forever opens up, and to be one of the first people to go and see it would be quite special. And I've got a mate who lives there at the moment, so hello Neil. What's my favourite memory travelling? Well, that's a really tough one, given I've been to something like 100 countries. I thought long and hard about this one, but I'm going to go for somewhere in India. There are lots of places I could have picked, but I'm going to pick the Golden Temple at Amritsar. Not a religious person, I'm certainly not of the Sikh faith, but the tranquility there, the beauty, the friendliness, it was a remarkable place. I tell a story where I was sitting there just meditating by myself, and a chap walks up to me with a massive Sikh beard and the turban and the full outfit, and he looks at me and in the broadest Birmingham accent says, "It's lovely here, isn't it?" So the final section is about YouTube itself, and the first question is, what advice would I give people looking to set up a channel? Well, there's a couple of things. Firstly, don't do it for the money. You may make some money, but it's a long, hard road before you do so. Be consistent. You know, there's a lot of good advice out there, but make videos that people want to watch is the best advice that you can get, and do it consistently. If that's once every 2 weeks, if it's once every week, if it's once every day, it doesn't really matter as long as you achieve that consistency. And be prepared for some negativity as well. I've been very lucky to have a minimal amount of negativity in the feedback on my channel. A couple of moments, but generally it's all been very positive, which I'm very grateful for. But I think you do need to have a bit of a thick skin if you are going to put yourself in the public eye. You may not be surprised to hear that I have made a video in which I talk about some of my experiences in monetizing on YouTube. I'll put a link up to it here. The next question is, what is the best thing about being on YouTube? And the answer to that really is easy for me, which is the creative freedom. It's quite refreshing to actually be free to do what I feel is right and is entertaining, rather than what might necessarily be always the right thing to do. So the next question is whether I've ever thought about making videos about more obscure airlines like Noel Phillips. This is a bit of a complicated answer. I think these days Noel Phillips videos are as much about Noel Phillips as they are about the airline he's reviewing. So his viewers are watching for him and the airline is secondary. I'm not there, and I don't know if I ever will be there, and I really don't know if that's what I want to achieve, people watching for me rather than the reviews. But I get a lot of my new viewers from people searching for British Airways or for Aegean or for airports or for specific routes or specific aircraft. And if I were to do a lot of really, really niche content on airlines that no one's ever heard of, I'm not going to pick up much traffic from people searching for that particular type of content. Plus I've got a lot more mainstream airlines that I haven't been on yet. So yes, I would love to make that sort of video. I will make the occasional one, but I don't think that'll be the focus of the channel for a while yet. I really don't think you guys are watching this for me, are you? I don't know. Tell me in the comments. And the last question really is, what would I do differently? Well, not that much, I think. I did quite a lot of research before I started, so I knew most of the worst pitfalls to avoid, and I've navigated my way through fairly carefully so as to not make any massive clangers. But I think the one thing that I would have done is not put a focus on cruise content so early in my channel. It has confused YouTube. You can see my numbers drop off quite significantly whenever a cruise video comes along, which segues me very nicely to the exciting bit of news that I promised you at the very start of this video, which is that I have established a second channel. I'm going to be moving my existing cruise content onto a new channel, and any future cruise content I create is going to go on that channel as well. That will allow YouTube to much better understand what's going on when I stand on a ship and talk about the food and the drink. That channel is called Matt's Oceans, as an accompaniment to Matt's Planet. It's live. I will be progressively moving my old videos across over the next couple of weeks, and new content will start to land on it in the next week or two. So if you like my cruise content, you'll now have a home dedicated to it, and if you didn't much enjoy it, you won't find it clogging up your feed on Matt's Planet from here on in. So that's the big news, and I would love it if you could all go and click the subscribe button on Matt's Oceans so I can get that channel monetized as quickly as possible. So thanks for watching. Apologies to anyone whose question I didn't answer. I'll go back and I'll give you personalized answers to the question that you originally asked if I didn't cover it in this video. Thanks for watching. Thanks so much for subscribing. 5,000 is more than I thought I would ever get. So give this video a like if you enjoyed it. Leave me a comment. Hey, let's make a start on the questions for the 10,000 subscriber special. Subscribe if by some miracle you're new, and if you would like to support what I'm doing more directly, I do have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the description below. And subscribe to Matt's Oceans. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.